"You don't recognize me at all, do you?" Those 7 words dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water, and everything around me seemed to stop moving. I was standing at the defense table with no attorney beside me, my father's house on the line, while across the room my uncle's lawyer sat with the calm, satisfied posture of a man who had already decided how this story would end. Then the judge tilted her head and looked at me a second time, longer this time, like she was trying to place a face from an old photograph. "You were wearing a uniform that night," she said quietly. My throat closed. I had absolutely no idea what she meant. Then she said the name of a small town I had passed through years earlier, back when I was still enlisted, and my hands began to tremble because I understood all at once that this was not idle courtroom small talk. She remembered something about me. I didn't remember anything about her. 3 months before that morning, I had believed the hardest thing I would ever face was burying my father. I was about to learn how wrong that belief was. My father, Thomas Ellis, passed away peacefully in his sleep after years of fighting a failing heart. He was 63, hard-headed in the most lovable way, the sort of man who would rather spend a Saturday fixing a leaking pipe himself than pay someone to do it in 20 minutes. He owned exactly one thing that meant more to him than anything else, and it had nothing to do with money. It was the modest 2-story house on Larkspur Lane where he and my mother had raised me from the time I could walk. The siding was faded, the cabinets still wore their original 1990s hardware, and the basement smelled permanently of sawdust, because my father had spent half his life down there repairing furniture for anyone in the neighborhood who asked. But it was home, in every sense that word could hold. My mother had died 6 years before him, and after that my father refused to change a single thing. Her chipped yellow teacup stayed on the shelf above the stove. Her recipe cards stayed taped beside the refrigerator exactly where she'd left them. Whenever I was stationed somewhere far away and having a rough stretch, he would send me pictures of that house. "Come on home," he'd write underneath them. "The porch light's always on for you." His will was about as uncomplicated as a will could be. The house would come to me. Everything else, the savings, the tools, a few pieces of furniture, would be split evenly among the rest of the family. My father's younger brother, my Uncle Gerald, received some investment accounts and a handful of personal items. He was not pleased about the house. At first I told myself his anger was grief wearing a different mask. Then the letters started arriving. Gerald claimed my father had promised him the property years before, that he'd covered the cost of major repairs, that my father had leaned on him more than anyone else in the family, and that this debt entitled him to the house. Eventually, through a hired attorney, he filed a formal claim against my father's estate. The first time I read the paperwork, I was certain there had been some clerical error. My father had never once mentioned that Gerald held any claim on the house. I called every attorney I could find. One wanted a retainer larger than my entire savings account. Another was booked out for months. A third looked over the filing and told me gently that probate disputes like this could become expensive faster than most people expect. I had some savings, but most of it was earmarked for my transition out of the service and the repairs the old house desperately needed. Still, I kept calling. I kept searching, and the court date arrived faster than I was ready for. So I walked into that courtroom alone. I wore a plain navy suit that morning instead of my uniform, pulled my hair back tight, and carried a single folder holding every document I had managed to gather. Across the room, Gerald sat beside his attorney, a man whose posture radiated confidence and preparation. Gerald looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't warmth in that expression. It was the smile of someone who already believed he had won. His attorney spoke first, arguing that Gerald had poured significant money into the property over the years, and that my father had always intended the house to pass to him. Then he produced a piece of paper, an agreement supposedly signed by my father, and slid it toward the bench. I stared at it from across the room. My father's signature sat at the bottom, and for one sickening moment I couldn't breathe. It looked correct, almost too correct. "Ms. Ellis, do you have counsel representing you today?" the attorney asked. "No," I answered. "I see," he said, and something about the flatness of those 2 words made heat rise up my neck. "Ms. Ellis, you understand you are representing yourself?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I want. "Ed." She examined the agreement, then looked up. Do you have any evidence that contradicts this document? I opened my folder, bank statements, tax records, copies of the will, printed emails, everything I'd collected in weeks. But under the weight of that courtroom, all of it looked painfully thin against Gerald's attorney's polished exhibits and total composure. I glanced across the aisle at my uncle. He no longer looked angry, he looked relieved. That's when the judge went quiet for several long seconds, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "Ms. Ellis," she said again. I looked up. "You don't recognize me at all, do you?" The room seemed to fall away around me. I shook my head. "No, Your Honor, I'm sorry, I don't." She leaned back slightly in her chair. "You were wearing a uniform that night." My pulse started hammering. What night? She named a highway, then a storm, then a town I hadn't thought about in years. I knew the place immediately. I knew the night immediately. I still had no idea who she was. The judge looked down at the case file in front of her, then back up at me. "I need to make a disclosure before we go any further," she said. Gerald's attorney straightened in his chair like he'd been shocked with static. She explained, carefully, that she had encountered me years earlier under circumstances that had nothing to do with the case in front of her, and that she could not allow that history to color the proceeding in any way, fairly or unfairly. Then she made a decision I had never seen coming. She recused herself. Gerald's confident expression cracked for the first time. The judge rose from the bench. Before she left the courtroom, she looked directly at me one more time. "There is something in this record," she said, "that deserves a much closer look." Then she was gone. I stood frozen at the defense table. I had walked into that room certain I was about to lose my father's house. I walked out with no ruling, no lawyer, and no understanding of why a judge from years earlier remembered my face. But for the first time since Gerald had filed his claim, I had the strange, quiet sense that I wasn't approaching the end of my father's story. I was standing at the beginning of a truth he'd never had the chance to tell me himself. The town the judge had named was Millfield, Ohio. The road was County Route 9. The storm had rolled through 7 years earlier, one of the worst nights of rain I had ever driven through. I was still in the Army, coming home from a training rotation, and the rain fell so hard the headlights ahead blurred into smears of white. Traffic crawled to a stop. Thunder rattled my windows with every flash of lightning. Then I saw the wreck. A sedan had spun across 2 lanes and slammed into the concrete median, hood crushed nearly in half. I pulled over without thinking twice, grabbed my phone, and sprinted through the rain. A woman was trapped inside, conscious and terrified. "Please," she kept saying, "don't leave me here." "I'm not going anywhere," I told her and meant it. I reached through the shattered window and held her hand, talking to her about nothing in particular because I knew panic could turn a bad night into a fatal one. I asked where she lived. I asked if she had kids waiting for her. She said yes, and I told her to keep breathing. Help was almost there. Firefighters cut the door free. Paramedics stabilized her while police held back traffic. Right before they loaded her into the ambulance, she turned toward me. "What's your name, soldier?" "Elena, just Elena," I told her. She managed a weak laugh. Then the doors closed, and I never saw her again. At least, I thought I hadn't. Now, sitting in my car outside the courthouse 7 years later, her face came rushing back to me all at once. And with it, I finally understood who the judge was. She had not been a judge on that stormy night. She had been the woman trapped inside that crushed sedan. Her name was Judge Elena Voss. After the hearing, I sat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes without moving, both hands still gripping the wheel. My phone buzzed. It was Gerald. "Hope you enjoyed your little performance in there," the message read. I didn't answer. A second message came through a moment later. "You should settle while you still have the chance." I flipped the phone face down on the passenger seat. For the first time, something clicked into place. Gerald wasn't afraid of losing this case. He was afraid of what I might find if I kept digging. The case was reassigned to a different judge within the week. Gerald's attorney fired off another letter demanding I accept a settlement. The offer was almost insulting, a small cash payment in exchange for walking away from the house entirely and agreeing that neither side would raise the matter again. I read it twice, then I thought of my father's handwriting, "Come on home," the porch lights always on for you. I wrote back that I would not be accepting. The next morning I did what I had learned to do in uniform whenever a situation felt too tangled to see clearly. I built a timeline. My father bought the house in 1997. My mother passed in 2019. My father updated his will in 2020. Gerald claimed he had begun paying for major repairs starting in 2018. But the bank records told a different story entirely. Every contractor had been paid directly from my father's own account. Gerald claimed he had paid for a new roof in 2018. The canceled check for that job had come from my father's checking account, not his. I checked another expense. Same story. Nearly every cost Gerald claimed as his own contribution had actually come out of my father's pocket. I sat back in my chair. Why would you lie about something this easy to disprove? Then I noticed the date on the disputed agreement itself. March 9, 2020. I knew that date. My father had been admitted to the hospital that week after a cardiac scare, and he'd stayed there for 4 days straight. I dug out his medical records to be sure. March 9th. Hospitalized, not home, not meeting with anyone about property, not signing anything. I stared at that page until the numbers blurred. My hands had gone cold. I called the attorney who'd previously told me he couldn't take my case. He agreed to give me a few minutes on the phone. When I laid out what I'd found, his tone changed almost instantly. "Do you have the original document?" he asked, "or only a copy?" "Only a copy." "Then try to get the original if it's possible. And don't accuse anyone of forgery yet." "Why not?" "Because if you're right," he said, "the evidence is going to speak for itself far better than you can." That sentence stayed lodged in my chest for days. The next morning I called a local legal aid office and explained my situation. They couldn't represent me for the entire case, but an attorney there, a woman named Renee Castillo, agreed to review some of my documents and point me toward what to look for. She studied the disputed agreement carefully, then tapped the signature. "Is this how your father normally signed his name?" "Yes," I said. She set it beside older documents I had brought. "It's close," she said. My heart dropped, but she kept going. "Close isn't the same thing as authentic." Then she tapped the date. "His medical records might matter a great deal here." I nodded. "Who witnessed the signature?" she asked. I looked down at the document. A name was printed beneath a signature line. Diane Marsh. I knew that name too. Diane had worked for Gerald's small contracting business years before. Renee looked up at me. "Find her." That night I dug through old emails and public records until I found an address on the far side of Columbus. I had no idea what I would learn when I finally knocked on her door, but I knew one thing for certain. My father had spent his final years believing he had secured this house for me. I was going to find out exactly what Gerald was trying to take, and why he was so sure I would never uncover how. Diane Marsh lived in a small ranch house about 20 minutes outside the city. I sat parked across the street for nearly 5 full minutes before I found the nerve to walk up and knock. I wasn't afraid of Diane herself. I was afraid of what she might tell me. If she confirmed the document was genuine, I could lose the house entirely. If she said it was false, I would still have to prove it in a courtroom. Either answer was going to hurt. I knocked. A woman in her late 60s opened the door, gray hair pulled back loosely, reading glasses pushed up on her head. "Can I help you?" "Are you Diane Marsh?" Her expression shifted slightly. "Yes." "My name is Marin Ellis. I'm Thomas Ellis's daughter." She went quiet for several seconds, then she opened the door wider. "Come in." Her living room was small and warm, family photos crowding one wall. She offered me coffee. I declined and set a copy of the disputed agreement on the table instead. She didn't touch it right away. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "My uncle's attorney submitted it in court." Her face lost color almost instantly. "I was afraid of that," she murmured. My heart started pounding. "You recognize it?" "I recognize my own name on it," she said, pulling off her glasses. "Marin, I never watched your father sign this document." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "Then why is your signature here?" "I signed something," she admitted, "but not this, not with him in the room." Gerald brought me paperwork at the office one afternoon and told me it was routine business paperwork needing a second signature. I didn't read every line. I trusted him. Was my father there? I asked. Did you ever see him sign anything? No, she said to both. Then why put your name down as a witness? She looked down at her hands for a long moment. Because I trusted your uncle, she said finally. That sentence landed somewhere painfully familiar. My father had trusted his own brother too, right up until the end. Diane told me she'd left Gerald's company only a few months after that day with no idea the paperwork would ever surface in a court case. Then her voice dropped. Gerald asked me never to bring it up, she said. He told me it would only cause problems. I asked problems for who, but she didn't answer. I took a breath. Diane, my father was in the hospital on the date this agreement claims he signed it. Her eyes went wide. Then it couldn't have happened the way that paper says. That's exactly what I believe, I said. She stood and disappeared down the hallway. A few minutes later, she returned carrying an old cardboard box and began sorting through notebooks, tax papers, and old photographs. Eventually, she pulled out a small black notebook. I used to keep track of everything work-related in here, she explained. Meetings, appointments, deliveries. She flipped through the pages until her finger stopped. March 9, 2020, she read aloud. I leaned forward. What does it say? She turned the notebook toward me. In faded blue ink, office closed early. Gerald left around 3, no meeting with Thomas. I stared at those words until my eyes burned. That was the exact date on the fake agreement. Yes, she said quietly. I felt tears rise in my throat. For the first time, I had more than a suspicion. I had an actual witness with actual proof willing to speak. I asked if she would talk to my attorney. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Yes. Before I left, she caught my sleeve gently. I'm sorry, Marin. For what? For not asking more questions back then, she said. I didn't know how to answer that. On the drive home, I kept turning her words over. Maybe that was exactly how family betrayals happened, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, through years of silence, assumptions, and people convincing themselves that something wasn't really their responsibility to question. When I got home, there was a new message waiting from Gerald. Stop digging, it read, just that. I stared at the screen for a long time, then I didn't delete it, I saved it. The next morning I brought everything to Renee, my legal aid attorney. She read through the notebook, the medical records, and the disputed agreement without saying a word. Finally, she looked up. This is significant, she said. Can we prove the document is a fake? Not yet, she said, and I felt my chest sink a little. But we may be able to show it couldn't possibly have been signed when they claim it was. She explained the next step would be authentication, tracking down where my father actually was that day, where the alleged notarization supposedly took place, and whether Diane had witnessed anything real at all. Then let's find those records, I said. She smiled slightly. You're starting to understand something. A courtroom isn't about who tells the most convincing story. It's about who can actually prove what they say. That afternoon, I requested additional property records. The disputed agreement claimed to have been notarized by a man named Harold Boyd, still a licensed notary in the state. When I called his office, he wouldn't discuss the matter without proper legal process, but he agreed to preserve his records if formally requested. I passed everything along to Renee. 2 days later, she called me. Marin, we found something. What is it? The notary's logbook, she said. It doesn't match your uncle's document at all. I sat down hard. What does that mean? It means we need to look a lot more closely at how this agreement was actually created, she said. There's something else too. What? The witness signature, she said. It may not match Diane's real signature from the same period at all. I closed my eyes. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I could see an actual path through it. But Gerald wasn't finished. His attorney filed a new motion accusing me of harassing family members and attempting to fabricate evidence. Gerald wanted my objections dismissed outright. He wanted the house, and he was clearly growing desperate to get it. At the next hearing, his attorney looked straight at me. "You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Ellis." I said nothing. Gerald leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, who smiled and turned back to me. "You're going to have to prove every bit of this." I looked down at the folder in my hands. For the first time in weeks, I actually smiled, because I finally understood something important. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I only needed to prove it. And somewhere buried in an old notary's logbook was the one piece of truth my uncle had forgotten to erase. The notary's logbook changed everything. 2 days after Renee reviewed it, she asked me to come to her office. Documents were spread across her desk when I arrived. "Marin," she said, "the agreement your uncle submitted claims your father signed it on March 9, 2020. The notary's own logbook doesn't show any notarization that day at all." "So the document is fake," I said. "Careful," she said. "We can say the document is inconsistent with the notary's officia. L records, that's not quite the same as proving who created it." I nodded. "There's more," she continued and handed me a photocopy. It was a logbook page. The entries surrounding March 9th were unmistakable. No Thomas Ellis, no property transfer, no matching signature. But there was something else too. The notary had recorded that his office had closed early that day due to a family emergency of his own. The supposed notarization on the agreement was time-stamped 4:15 in the afternoon. That was flatly impossible. I sat back in the chair. My father had been in a hospital bed. The witness had never actually watched him sign anything. The notary's own records proved the notarization couldn't have happened as claimed, and yet Gerald had walked that document into a courtroom and presented it as fact. Anger rose in me fast. Renee noticed. "Don't confront your uncle," she said. "Why not?" "Because right now you have something far better than an argument," she said. "You have evidence." I took a slow breath. She was right. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the man behind all of it. Gerald wasn't a stranger. He'd eaten dinner at our kitchen table more times than I could count. He'd helped my father rebuild the back fence after my mother died. He'd stood beside me at her funeral with his hand on my shoulder. How does someone who shared that many memories with a family become the person trying to steal the last thing his own brother left behind? That evening I drove back to my father's house. I went through every drawer in his little home office, not looking for ammunition, just looking for context. My father had always been meticulous, labeled folders for receipts, spiral notebooks full of handwritten notes. After hours of searching, I found a locked metal box tucked beneath a stack of old tax records. I recognized it instantly. My father had owned that box for as long as I could remember. I found the small key taped under the bottom drawer of his desk, exactly where he always hid things he didn't want lost. Inside were photographs, old bank statements, insurance papers, a handful of letters. At the very bottom sat an envelope with my name written across the front in his handwriting. My hands were already shaking before I opened it. "My girl, if you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped never would. I know your uncle has asked about the house more than once. I have told him no more than once too. Gerald believes I owe him something because he helped me through some hard years. He did help me, and I'll always be grateful for that. But helping someone doesn't hand them ownership of something that was never theirs to begin with." I swallowed hard at the next line. "Your mother wanted this house to always be a place our family could come home to." I looked around the room. Her photographs still lined the walls. Her old sewing machine still sat by the window. My father had preserved every trace of her. The letter continued. "If Gerald ever challenges the will, don't fight him out of hatred. Fight him because I made your mother a promise." I pressed the letter against my chest. For weeks, I had believed my father simply wanted me to inherit a building. Now I understood. He wanted me to protect a memory that mattered more than any deed. One more item sat in the box, a small flash drive. My father had never been comfortable with technology. He still printed his emails on paper. Why would he leave behind a flash drive? I plugged it into my laptop. 3 files, a folder of old photographs, a scanned earlier draft of his will, and an audio recording. I clicked play. Static, then my father's voice, tired and older than I remembered. If you're listening to this, Marin, I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into any of this. Then a second voice entered. Gerald. You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be, Thomas. No, I'm making it clear, my father answered. You don't need this house. Marin does. Gerald laughed bitterly. You're going to hand everything to a daughter who barely comes around anymore. She serves this country, Gerald, my father said firmly. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. Silence. Then Gerald said something that turned my blood cold. What if she never comes back at all? Then the house stays hers anyway, my father answered without hesitation. The recording ran for several more minutes, Gerald pleading that he was in financial trouble and the house could save his failing business, my father refusing every time. Near the end, he said the words that would eventually decide everything. If anything happens to me, Marin gets the house. There will be no confusion about that. I sat alone in the dark, playing it back again and again, finally understanding exactly why Gerald had grown so desperate. He wasn't simply trying to inherit a house. He was trying to erase his own brother's final, deliberate decision. The next morning I brought the recording to Renee. She listened carefully, all the way through twice. This could matter a great deal, she said. Can we actually use it? We'll need to establish when it was recorded and confirm the identities of both voices, she said. But yes, it may help significantly. I nodded, then she looked at me seriously. There's something else we need to talk through, she said. What your uncle might have known about this recording existing. I felt a chill move through me. If he suspected your father had documented that conversation, that gives him a clear motive to manufacture a different document that appeared to override the will entirely. I stared at her. So the fake agreement might have been created specifically to contradict what my father actually wanted, out loud, on record. The pieces were finally beginning to lock into place, but one question still sat unanswered. Why had that first judge recognized me at all? That afternoon, a formal notice arrived from the court concerning Judge Elena Voss, the woman who had recused herself. She had disclosed our earlier encounter and attached the original emergency report from that storm 7 years before. I read through it slowly. Then I noticed something I had completely forgot. The report listed a second person present at the accident scene that night, Gerald Ellis. I stared at his name printed right there on the page. Why had Gerald been at that accident scene? And why had the judge remembered my face but never mentioned his? I called Renee immediately. I think there's something here we're missing, I told her. She went quiet for a moment. What did you find? My uncle was at that accident scene, the one from 7 years ago. Another long pause. Then she said quietly, we need to find out exactly why. I looked down at my father's letter sitting on the desk beside me. For the first time, I understood that this courtroom battle might not have started with a house at all. The house might only be the final chapter of a much older story, and I was finally close enough to see the rest of it. The final hearing began at 9:30 on a gray Tuesday morning. By then, the fear had mostly drained out of me. Not because I felt certain of winning, but because I finally understood something my father had taught me without ever saying it out loud. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to raise your voice. You only need to make it impossible to look away from. I walked into the courthouse carrying the same worn folder I had carried weeks before, except now it was 3 times as thick. Inside were copies of my father's will, his hospital records, bank statements, property documents, Diane's signed statement, the notary's logbook pages, and the audio recording pulled from that flash drive. Renee sat beside me. She wasn't representing me at no cost, and she couldn't handle every part of the case, but she had agreed to help me through the most complicated legal pieces. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I wasn't standing completely alone. Across the aisle, Gerald sat beside his attorney. His lawyer still looked confident. Gerald did not. His eyes kept flicking toward the folder in my hands. The judge entered, everyone rose, and the hearing began. Gerald's attorney argued first, insisting the disputed agreement proved my father's true intent to transfer the property. He described my objections as the confused reaction of a grieving daughter who had misread her father's financial arrangements. Then he added, "Your Honor, Ms. Ellis seems determined to turn a simple property dispute into an attack on her own family." My jaw tightened. Renee leaned toward me. "Don't react," she whispered. I nodded. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Ellis, you may respond." I stood. "My objection isn't based on what I believe my father wanted," I said. "It's based on exactly what these documents show." I handed the clerk my first exhibit. My father's medical records confirm he was hospitalized on the exact date this agreement claims he signed it. Gerald shifted in his seat. His attorney objected. The judge reviewed the records herself. "Objection noted," she said. "Continue." I handed over the next exhibit. The notary's own logbook shows no notarization for this agreement occurred on the date listed. Gerald's attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, we dispute that interpretation." "Then you may explain the discrepancy," the judge said evenly. He hesitated. For the first time, real uncertainty crossed his face. Renee submitted the logbook page proving the notary's office had closed early that afternoon, yet the alleged notarization was time-stamped for later that same day. He had no ready answer. Then Diane took the stand, nervous but steady, refusing to look away. She confirmed Gerald had brought her paperwork years earlier, that she had never watched my father sign anything, and that she had never even met with him that day. Gerald's attorney tried a different angle. "Ms. Marsh, are you certain that signature is truly yours?" "Yes," she said. He allowed himself a small smile, as if he'd found an opening, "but I did not sign it as a witness to Thomas Ellis's signature," she added firmly. The smile disappeared instantly. He tried once more. "Isn't it possible you simply don't recall it correctly?" "I may forget where I set down my reading glasses," she said. "I do not forget watching a man sign away his own home, because I never did." A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge requested the full notary records. The evidence in the room was becoming very difficult to explain away. Then Renee stood again. "We have one final exhibit," she said, and submitted the audio recording. Gerald's face changed the instant he saw it. He knew exactly what it was. The recording played through the courtroom speakers. My father's voice filled the room first. "If anything happens to me, Marin gets the house. There will be no confusion." Then Gerald's voice, "You're going to hand everything to a daughter who barely comes around anymore. And my father, steady as ever, she serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment." I watched Gerald stare at the floor as it played. When it ended, the courtroom sat in complete silence. His attorney rose slowly. "Your Honor, we would ask for time to challenge the authenticity of this recording." The judge agreed authentication would be required, and Renee was ready for that. The original device had been preserved, and the file's metadata and origin could be properly examined. No shortcuts, no wild accusations, only evidence. Then something happened none of us expected. The judge asked Gerald directly whether he disputed that the two voices belonged to him and my father. His attorney whispered urgently. Gerald swallowed hard. "No," he said quietly. "Mr. Ellis, are you telling this court you do not dispute that this conversation took place?" the judge asked. Gerald closed his eyes. "No." His attorney's head snapped toward him. Gerald kept going anyway. "I just never thought she'd actually find it." My chest sank, not because I had won, but because I finally understood exactly how far he had been willing to go. The judge requested clarification. His attorney immediately asked for a recess. During the break, Gerald caught up to me in the hallway, his face looking older than it had that morning. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I understand plenty," I said. "I was about to lose everything my father left me. You told yourself he owed it to you, he didn't." "I helped him more than once," he said. "And he thanked you for it," I said. "That wasn't enough for you." His voice cracked. I realized then that his greed had never really been about the house at all. It was about years of quiet resentment, a belief that my father had always gotten the better version of everything, and that the house was proof my father had chosen me over him. But my father had never been choosing between two brothers. He had simply been deciding what to do with his own property. The hearing resumed. Gerald's attorney no longer wore his earlier confidence. He requested more time to review the mounting evidence. The judge granted a limited continuance for proper authentication. Several weeks later, the final ruling came. The notary confirmed under oath that his logbook held no record of the alleged transaction. Diane's testimony held firm. The medical records confirmed my father's hospitalization beyond dispute. The recording was formally authenticated, and property records proved Gerald had never actually paid for the repairs he claimed. Piece by piece, the story Gerald had built collapsed under its own weight. Finally, the judge delivered her decision. The disputed agreement was rejected outright. Gerald's claim to the house was denied in full. The house remained part of my father's estate, and under his valid, unchallenged will, passed to me. I sat perfectly still. I didn't cheer, I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes for a moment. My father had won. Not because I had defeated my uncle in some dramatic battle, but because the truth had outlived him and finally been allowed to speak for itself. Outside the courthouse, Gerald stopped me on the steps. "I'm sorry," he said. I looked at him, he was crying. "I know that doesn't fix anything," he added. "No," I said, "it doesn't." He nodded slowly, then he asked the question I never expected to hear. "Can I see the house one more time?" I looked at him for a long moment, and understood, in that instant, that winning the case had actually been the easier part of all this. What I chose to do with that victory would tell me exactly who I really was. We drove there separately. When I unlocked the front door, Gerald hesitated behind me on the porch, staring down the hallway before he stepped inside. "Your dad painted that himself," he said quietly. "I know." "He hated that color," Gerald said, almost smiling. "He chose it himself," I said. "I know," Gerald said. "That's exactly why I used to give him grief about it." We walked slowly through the living room. Everything sat exactly where I had before any of this began. My mother's photograph still rested on the mantel. My father's worn recliner still waited by the window. Gerald stopped in front of an old photograph, my father and him as young men, standing beside their first car together, both grinning like the world belonged to them. I had seen that picture 100 times before. That day, I saw something different in it. Two brothers who had once loved each other completely, long before money and pride ever got between them. He touched the edge of the frame gently. "He was always better at everything," he murmured. "That isn't true," I said. "It felt true," he said. "When your dad bought this house, I was barely getting by. When Mom died, everyone leaned on him, not me. And then you came home in that uniform, and he looked at you like you were the best thing he'd ever done." He wiped his eyes. I thought this house was the last thing left that I could still take from him. "That wasn't really the house talking," I said. "That was your own anger." "I know," he admitted. Then after silence, I lied about everything. He admitted he had wildly exaggerated how much money he'd put into the property, convincing himself over the years that helping my father a handful of times entitled him to ownership of something that was never his. When my father refused him outright, that conviction curdled into bitterness, and he'd pressured an old business contact into helping fabricate paperwork to make his claim look stronger than it was. He didn't try to make excuses for it. He knew there could still be real consequences waiting for him. I listened quietly. Part of me wanted to tell him he deserved every consequence headed his way. Another part kept hearing my father's voice. "Don't fight him because you hate him." My father had never asked me to shield Gerald from accountability. He had only asked me not to let this turn me cruel. "Gerald," I said, "I can't pretend this never happened. You hurt me. You tried to take away the last thing Dad left behind for me." He looked down at the floor. "I know. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you either," I said. He looked up at that, and for the first time I saw genuine relief cross his face. Not forgiveness yet, just the possibility of it, sitting somewhere within reach. I told him forgiveness would require real accountability. He would need to cooperate fully with whatever legal process followed regarding the falsified document. He agreed. He also agreed to repay the legitimate debts he owed and to stop making any further claims against the estate. We didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment. Some wounds need time to breathe before anyone can touch them again, but when he finally left, he paused at the front door. "Your dad would be proud of you," he said. I looked toward the porch light, the same one he used to leave burning every single night I was away. "I hope so," I said. After Gerald left, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long while. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, the house didn't feel like a pile of evidence anymore. It felt like home again. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Judge Elena Voss. It had nothing to do with the case. There was no legal advice inside it at all. She had simply written to me about the night we first crossed paths. She told me that after the crash, she remembered being utterly terrified, hearing a young woman's voice telling her, over and over, "I'm not leaving." She hadn't known my last name, where I lived, or if she'd ever see me again. But she had never forgotten my face, or what it felt like to be helpless and have a stranger refuse to walk away. Then she explained something that has stayed with me since. The moment she recognized me at that defense table, she knew she couldn't remain the judge on my case. She hadn't stepped aside to help me win. She'd stepped aside because fairness had to hold for both sides equally. She had simply recognized me, and recognizing me meant she had to leave. That distinction mattered more than I can easily explain. I folded her letter and placed it beside my father's. Two people, from two entirely different moments in my life, had each reminded me of the exact same lesson. Character isn't what you display when everyone is watching. It's what you choose when nobody is left to reward you for choosing it. I eventually repaired the house properly. I kept my mother's chipped teacup exactly where it belonged. I kept my father's workbench untouched, and even that stubborn, ugly paint color he'd loved. But I added one thing of my own, a small table on the front porch, the spot where family could sit and remember that the house had never truly been about money. It had always been about belonging. I also walked away with something practical. If you have a will, keep it current and accessible. Keep property records, beneficiary information, and important messages organized. Don't assume the people you love will automatically agree with each other once you're gone. And if you're ever pulled into a probate dispute, don't wait until the last moment to seek help. If private counsel is out of reach, look into local legal aid organizations or bar association referral programs. Representing yourself is possible in many civil matters, but property disputes can spiral quickly. I learned that the hard way. I walked into that courtroom believing that having no lawyer meant I had no chance at all. It didn't. But I also learned that real courage doesn't mean refusing every offer of help. Sometimes courage looks exactly like admitting you need it. And as for revenge, I thought I wanted it badly. But once it was over, I understood revenge would have only handed me another hollow victory to celebrate alone. Justice gave me something far more lasting, the truth, and forgiveness gave me the chance to finally set down the weight of everything my uncle had done. I still think about that courtroom sometimes. I remember standing there completely alone. I remember his attorney's confident smile. I remember believing I was about to lose absolutely everything. And most of all, I remember a judge looking directly at me and asking, "You don't recognize me at all, do you?" For a long time, I believed that single question had changed my life simply because she remembered my face from a stormy night years earlier. Now I understand it changed my life, because it reminded me exactly who I wanted to become. My father didn't leave me a house so I could wage a war against my own family. He left it to me because he trusted me to protect what truly mattered without losing myself in the process. And maybe that is the greatest inheritance any parent can ever leave behind. Not money, not property. A lesson about who you choose to become when life hands you every excuse to grow bitter instead. If any part of this reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment to think about what you would fight to protect, what you might eventually be able to forgive, and what you would never compromise on, no matter the cost. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making someone else pay for what they've done. Sometimes it's simply walking away with your heart still fully intact.